I recently got my first tattoo. Nothing major, nothing huge, not insignificant. Something on my shoulder, black and white tattoo. I grew up in a household that really frowned on tattoos, oddly frowned on tattoos. Not for any, it wasn't like some sort of religious thing or whatever. I think my parents just were very, I don't know, they just seemed to be against it. So more recently, it was just sort of something that I had been thinking about doing, found a cool design, decided to go for it. My wife has some tattoos on her arm, but they look pretty cool. Figured I'd go for it. Why not? I was thinking about this though, in context of showing it to my children, because to me, it's nothing to hide or anything. If I was trying to hide a tattoo, I wouldn't have put it right on my shoulder. But it just got me thinking about what we do and don't share with our kids and how that could impact relationships, their relationship with us, their relationships with other people, anything of the sort. My dad died a couple years ago. He had been struggling with cancer for a couple years. Finally did him in. And, well, let me back up. Growing up, my dad and I didn't necessarily get along all that well. We had quite a lot of fights pretty often. He was a good bit older than other fathers of my friends. And so I always kind of felt like there might be a generational thing component to that. He always came off as strict by, the standards at least that I wanted as a kid. And as I got older, it became less and less of an issue, and I think we ultimately came to terms and had quite a nice, at least pleasant relationship. Probably starting by the time I was in college and then going on for, the next 20 years or so. So when he died, it's not like I felt that had been in a bad place or anything. In fact, it had all been very pleasant for a long time. However, I started hearing stories about my dad. I started hearing a lot of kind of interesting things. There was this story about him jumping off of some bridge with his brother to jump into either a river or a lake underneath that kept popping up. There were some stories about him and not necessarily reckless life choices, but he did many things throughout his life. He really he did some military stuff. He did academic stuff. He moved around a lot. He clearly was a restless person, at least at certain points in his life. Very intellectual guy. His career was college professor in philosophy and theology, so a very intellectual person. He had always come off to me as, again, very strict and straight-laced and conservative. I don't mean that in a political sense, but just in terms of his overall way of interacting with the world. Always came off as kind of a reserved and kind of, I don't know, conservative is really the best word I can think of. Again, I just don't mean in a political sense. One of the things, after hearing a lot of these stories about my dad, one of the things that occurred to me is that I didn't really know my dad. Not really. I mean, I knew him as a parent. I knew him as the father that he had put forth all those years. But there were all these years where I was doing what my parents largely considered to be reckless things, or I could easily see myself being the person jumping off bridges into lakes or taking long road trips across the desert with cars that break down or whatever. Like that, all of those things sound like things that I would do. I'm not saying that I have done all of those things, but those definitely sound like the sorts of things that I would do. And it occurred to me at some point that maybe we would have gotten along, better if I had known who he really was under the hood. Another thing that was on this train of thought, one of the things that kind of crystallized it for me, I had, again, a few years back, I bought one of the new Ford Broncos with a soft top. It can go back, take the doors off, kind of like a Jeep. And my mom is scared to death. My mom's still alive. She's scared to death of driving in this when I have the doors off and the roof back and all that kind of stuff. But she keeps saying, "Oh, your dad would have loved this. Your dad would have loved this." And her saying that was so incongruent with the dad that I thought about. I couldn't picture for a moment that my dad would have liked a convertible SUV or driving with no doors or anything of the sort. That's a very foreign thought to me. But the more I listened to family members who obviously knew him longer than I did, the more I realized that there was not just this whole other side to him, but that the core of who he was not this parental figure who I had always known him as. And this gets me thinking a lot about my relationship with my children. And striking the balance, I suppose, between showing your genuine self well, let me rephrase it. To what extent are you supposed to show your genuine self versus to what extent are you supposed to hide those things, or at least moderate them in a way that maybe where are you no longer being your genuine self? And what is the impact that could have with them? I've always felt that I've been pretty genuine with my kids. They are aware of my interests, at least, many of them. My hobbies, the things that I do and don't like. I don't really hold any of those things back. I make my opinions known about things, particularly topics that might be important to the development of a kid. So I don't feel like I'm hiding anything. But I wonder, but there's still this whole other piece where you also have to be the parent. And I'm not running around telling them about, maybe some of the questionable choices I made in college or some of the things I did, after college that maybe weren't, not things that you would want necessarily your kids to know about. But the question is why? And might they get to the end of their life, or I'm sorry, might I get to the end of my life and they find themselves reflecting whether or not they actually knew who I was all that time. So I was looking around a little bit, just poking around, trying to see if there was any interesting information on this topic out there. I kept bumping into a few things. One of the things I kept bumping into was really mostly talking about emotional vulnerability, and that being a big topic and a big difference in how parents are these days compared to maybe how they were, 40, 50, 60 years ago, especially fathers. That wasn't really what I was shooting to dive into. I kind of understand that topic. I'm not going to say I'm an expert on it or anything, but that's not something that's all that surprising or different or new in my viewpoint. What I was trying to figure out more was this how to what extent should you be your genuine self? I did find some interesting things about it. The thing that I found that was the most interesting was that the research does seem to show that you should do this, but do it with some moderation. Use common sense. It doesn't amount to much more than that. But interestingly, evidently, when kids get into their teenage years, that's a good time to really open up a bit as a person and show a little more of who you are. And apparently this has a lot to do with teenagers, apparently, according to research, and I have to look into this a little bit more, but apparently they are really good at being lie detectors or bullshit detectors. They're very good at knowing when someone is not being genuine with them, not being authentic. And if that's coming from their parent, that can set a relationship off to down a really bad path. So that was pretty interesting because that I would have thought naturally would have been a time that you didn't want to be overly genuine because of the level of impressionability that, teenagers tend to experience. But it makes sense, having digested a little bit, that becomes a good time because if you're not being genuine, they know. They can smell it on you. And that can put a relationship really down a bad path. My kids are not teenagers yet, but I think I'm going to take this piece of advice and just kind of tuck it away and try to, not that I don't think I would have done, not that I don't think I'm being genuine in general. I do. It was just an interesting tidbit, again, with my father dying, to realize, I would have liked to know that other guy. I think we would have gotten along better than I did with the version of my dad that I had growing up. And I'm not saying he did a bad job. I'm not saying he wasn't a good parent. It's just that I think I would have gotten along with who he really was. And I don't know why I never got to know that person. And I wouldn't want my kids to get to a point where they wonder why they never got to know the person that I am.